Hi everybody, welcome to Politifest 2024. If you've been here all day, you've heard this many times, but I'm going to do it again. Politifest 2024, can our government meet the moment? I'm MacKenzie Elmer, I'm the environment reporter at Voice of San Diego. I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. In case you're not familiar with us, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit news organization committed to holding public officials accountable and giving you, the public, the information you need to be advocates for good government. As a nonprofit, we depend on members, donors, and sponsors like you to make our work possible, so thank you for your support. I'd like to take a minute to recognize our sponsors who help make Politifest possible. A special thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego for being our partner for a 7th year. Our thanks to the Sequan Band of Kumeyaay Nation, the United Domestic Workers Union, AARP, the San Diego Foundation, Business for Good, Hitsky Development, the San Diego Municipal Employees Association, the Asian Business Association, Planned Parenthood of Pacific Southwest, Atlantis Group, and the Southern California Rental Housing Association. And I think San Diego Art Matters as well. We also like to recognize KPBS and iNewsSource, our public partners in Public Matters. We are partnering to share content, conversation, and events like Politifest to ensure all San Diegans understand their opportunity to participate in the democratic process, and that it means more than voting in an election. If you are unable to attend any of the sessions in person, don't worry. We will be posting the recordings on the Politifest page of our website next week. We welcome your questions. There's a volunteer who will be passing around note cards in the back, but they'll be up and about. If you raise your hand, they'll pass you a note card, give the note card back to them, and we will have those questions for the last 15 minutes of the debate. You can tweet along with the session and share your experience by using hashtag Politifest 2024 on social media and tag us on Instagram and Facebook. Before I introduce our panel, I've been asked to do a little climate change lesson. So here's how climate change works in like 4.5 minutes, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So this all begins with us burning fossil fuels. That energy-dense, ancient carbon buried beneath the soil that we now use in the form of oil and gas. When we drive our cars, we use electricity from gas-fired power plants. And we revive that once sleeping carbon back into the atmosphere in the form of a gas called carbon dioxide. That is bad for the planet. It turns out we've known that this has been a bad move for over 150 years, but too little, too late. Eunice Foote, a female American scientist, actually figured out in 1856 that carbon dioxide is really good at trapping the sun's radiation close to Earth instead of letting it escape back out into space, where much of it is supposed to go. In a sense, we are wrapping ourselves in a slightly thicker blanket of carbon dioxide, warming ourselves a bit too much with our own heat. So year after year, the more humanity uses fossil fuels, we're turning up the thermostat on the entire planet. It seems like climate change has been a slow process on human timescales, but on the Earth's timescale, it's a blink of an eye. So trapping more heat in Earth's energy system does a number of things. The main thing you need to know is climate change makes almost everything more extreme. The days get hotter, the droughts get longer, storms get stormier. San Diego County is expected to get 5 to 10 degrees hotter by 2100. We know from a study in 2019 that on really hot days or in heat waves, we get a 15% rise in hospitalizations in San Diego County during this hot weather. It also can affect mental health and exacerbate any kind of mental health issues that you may have. Because we have all this excess heat sticking around, it dries out landscapes, water sources, and jumbles up the timeline for when we expect rainy seasons to relieve our plants and animals from dry seasons. This drying of the landscape turns San Diego backcountry into a tinderbox. All that was once green in the rainy season becomes kindling for wildfire, like we saw in 2003 in the Cedar Fire, when over 200,000 acres burned, people died, and flames caused over $1.4 billion in damage. Surprise, surprise, more heat on Earth melts cold things, like glaciers or our icy shelves at our Earth's poles in the Arctic and Antarctic. An incredible amount of water is stored there. So as those begin to melt, which the Arctic really seems to be doing at a rapid pace, that adds more water to our oceans and makes them swallow more of the coast. It invades freshwater sources and also ecosystems. The ocean is actually one of our besties in the fight against climate change. Its waters soak up a lot of the heat that we're actually trapping on the planet, and it buries it in the deep ocean. But as our coldest depths of the ocean grow warmer, the oceans do as well, and that turns the ocean more acidic and harmful to life. This has all kinds of implications because the ocean and the atmosphere, like any marriage, react to one another and feel all kinds of weather that can be unpredictable and catastrophic. If you've ever ran a cold jam jar from the fridge under hot water to open it, you know heat causes things to expand. A warming ocean is also an expanding one, which is another reason why sea levels are rising. The ocean is expected to rise 3 feet come 2100 off the coast of San Diego. That means the highest tides and its waves will crash with more force and further ashore, putting coastal property at risk. And we've already seen that. That brings us to the major climate catastrophe that happened this year: floods, and how very biblical their damage can be. As the planet warms, so increases the process of evaporation, or water dissolving into the air, which means there's actually more water circulating in the atmosphere. That's another reason why storms or rain events are dropping more water than ever before, and in an unpredictably short amount of time. So San Diego's oceanside location also means that it's prone to getting hit by these streams of water called atmospheric rivers, which are storms that develop over ocean and then they dump when they hit land. And that's partly why January 22nd of this year was so catastrophic for our low-lying communities with undersized infrastructure for catching stormwater. Southeast San Diego is one of the region's first victims of climate change. Hundreds were displaced, and now it's up to the government to protect its people against storms like this, which is sure to visit San Diego again in the future. So good luck, government. And now introducing Will Huntsberry, investigative reporter at Voice of San Diego.
Thank you, MacKenzie, for that uplifting note to begin on. Today we're going to talk about how our community can meet this moment and these moments that we're going to increasingly face in the future. I think we've got some really interesting people here to talk about it who've dealt with it from very different angles. We've got the City Council President, Sean Elo-Rivera, who I think has been 3 years City Council President, was very involved in the floods in January, had some really interesting conversations with him about it at that time. We've got Ramsey Green here, and he is from San Diego, but he is going to bring us a little bit of outside perspective. He's spent the past 20 years in New Orleans, where it was his literal job to plan for climate change and the infrastructure needs that would have to be taken care of as storms increased. And then we also have Justin Lipford, who I'm very excited to have with us. He is the Director of Community Engagement and Belonging at the YMCA. That's his official title. But he is also just an incredible person who brings a lot of positivity to San Diego. And he unexpectedly got thrust into the flood response. And I was wondering if that's where we could start, Justin. When the floods happened, had you ever had any experience dealing with community disasters like that, and how did that go? How did you get pulled into it?
Hear me well? Yes? No. How about this? Better, right? Thanks, Will. So again, my name is Justin Lipford with the YMCA. Super excited to be here. I'm a San Diego lifelong resident, Chula Vista specifically. I've worked for the YMCA now for 10 years, but for 26 years I've been engaged in various forms of community work throughout the county. January 21st was a Monday, rains happened. My organization has a key location within this community, the Southeast community. I'm referring to the Jackie Robinson YMCA. On the first, close to about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon after the rains had dumped down, we started getting word from from Jackie Robinson on what they were seeing from a community need and community response, specifically the sheer damage that was happening and how we needed to get immediate supplies, basic need supplies to these families. That was the extent of my understanding of what went down that particular day. On my end, I asked their corporate office to be a part of it, connected to it, to help raise supplies through various forms and various community events. Within 3 days, I was fully immersed into helping our Jackie Robinson YMCA. And when I'm saying helping is, it's basically everything was triaged this first week, from supplies coming in, families coming in needing supplies, then a host of different community members assembling to figure out they can bring some order to the system. It was a system that needed to develop virtually overnight. No, to answer your question, no, I don't have experience in doing response on this level, nor have I seen a need for response on this level in San Diego in my 46 years.
Well, and it, as I think you were saying, Justin, it kind of developed on the fly. No one was ready for this. It was called a 1,000-year storm a lot of times, and we could debate about that a fair amount, and it would be legitimate, but I think we know these storms are going to increase in frequency. And what happened on the first occasion was that the community really created its own system in a lot of ways for triaging people. I mean, the Jackie Robinson YMCA, for those of y'all that don't know, it was the place to be. It is where everybody was showing up. It is where they were getting what they need. And that is not to say the government wasn't doing things as well. They certainly were. But the Jackie Robinson Y became the hub. I guess I want to go to Ramsey next, who's certainly dealt with flooding a lot and thought about flooding a lot. We're going to talk about prevention on this panel, but right now we're talking about response. What should a response look like in a scenario like that? What is a good response, Ramsey?
If I can just start, Will, very quickly saying this is like the first professional meeting I've spoken at in San Diego in 20 some odd years, and this is really cool. I'm sitting next to a guy making a reference to the Jackie Robinson Y, which I used to play basketball at on the travel YMCA team against Coach Brunker. And I've seen, yeah, man, this is great. Plus, I'm hearing Will's Southern accent, which is totally blowing my mind sitting here in San Diego. I'll just say I grew up in San Diego, and I, knew Scott Lewis when Voice of San Diego was getting started, and he was a transcript reporter. And seeing what you guys have done, Will, is amazing. And having an actual festival where I don't get to dress up like it's Jazz Fest, I have to look like I'm a government sort of official, is pretty exciting. I didn't know whether to wear a Hawaiian shirt or dress like a stiff, so I dressed like a stiff. Sorry, Sean. Sean's elected to office. He kind of has to do that depending on the environment. I'll give you sort of, it's a little bit what drove Justin you to act is why I got into what I got into. I was in graduate school. Hurricane Katrina hit in August 29, 2005, and it'll be 20 years next year. And I watched the news. And I was in grad school on a fellowship studying local and state government, and I got into it because of the San Diego pension crisis. And I thought, holy cow, a pension crisis leads to a once stable government hemorrhaging money because of political motivation of the 1996 Republican National Convention being here and putting too much money into that convention and not having money when the pension needed a payment. It was an amazing story, and that's kind of why I do what I do. In my mind, what you saw with Katrina is, for those of us in this world now, is a lesson in what government can do really well and what government failed and I think is far better at what it does now. When I look at San Diego, I don't know the challenges facing San Diego precisely. I know some of them. I sat in the meeting with the Tijuana River situation. But what I would say is this is an incredible moment to address climate change. And I look at my children. I have a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 10-year-old. And we spent this summer in Hawaii. I just flew in from Hawaii. I go every 6 weeks since the Maui wildfires. I have a client out there. And my kids are so tied up in nature, and they know what climate change is. This moment, thanks to the November 2021 IIJA, people call it the Biden infrastructure bill, alone was more money in government infrastructure and innovation investments than the New Deal and the Eisenhower interstate system combined in inflation-adjusted money. In August of 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Politics aside, there is more money out there to innovate and combat the impacts of climate change than at any other point in history. I think governments should be pursuing this money for the unique needs of their communities rapidly. particularly through mitigation, renewable energy. In Hawaii, public safety power shutoffs since the Lahaina wildfires. What you're seeing is the utility there doing remarkable things with sensory systems, field devices, etc. That is to say that government does a big thing. They put money, they move things, but I do really want to acknowledge at this moment in time, there are millions of Americans facing uncertainty right now, particularly 4 million Americans who have no power right now due to Hurricane Helene. And I was just on the phone with a friend of mine who lives in North Carolina, and he is trying to get a hold of how to get water to a community in Western North Carolina. These things are happening more and more, and the first people who are there to respond are people like Justin, community service organizations, and local governments. And what I learned in New Orleans is that government only works when it is responsive to the person who is most vulnerable. Low-income folks, elderly folks. I mean, look at the 1995 Chicago heat wave. Most of the government folks in the daily administration were on vacation on Lake Michigan, and you saw almost 1,000 elderly people quietly die in their homes because of a heat wave. And nobody knew it until a sociologist wrote a book about it. So I just want to stress mitigation and empowering local communities, nonprofit organizations, and first responders to do and act and prevent and move.
So, Sean, tell me how you feel like the response went after the January 22nd floods.
Thanks, Will. And I'll reiterate the appreciation for you all hosting this, everyone for attending. Not well, being totally honest. And what I'm going to try my best to do in these responses is, and in this conversation, is make sure that we're focused on people. Because a lot of times when we talk about climate, it can become kind of abstract. And that's important when we're talking about the global significance and impacts of climate change. But we just heard such a great example of why it's so important to focus on the people part of this. Because somewhere, as a very vulnerable person, who will have to deal with the consequences of that change. And if we start the conversation from that point, with that focus, we're going to have far better outcomes. Government worked hard on that day. I know that. I know that city employees went out there, and many of them didn't bat an eye. And I think about our lifeguards who jumped into water and they had no idea what was in that water, what the impacts would be. They dove in without asking a question because they wanted to help people. Tons of city workers went out there and tried very hard. But what we were not clearly prepared to do in the way that I wish we would have been is to meet people's needs. We did stuff, but we didn't make them feel like we were there for them. With few exceptions, right? There was examples of heroism from lifeguards and firefighters and police officers, but there were a lot more examples of that from community members responding to each other's needs. And so in the back and forth after the floods occurred, and while folks are still struggling, which I hope we have a chance to touch on at some point, there seemed to be some confusion about what was really being said and what wasn't. And I will say, just from government's perspective, one thing that I don't think we did well is hear what the community was saying. And it wasn't, sometimes people said you're not doing anything. And they said nothing's happening. And what was really being said there is like, you're not meeting our people's needs. It's not that we don't see that there's bulldozers moving mud or people pulling debris out. It's that there are still people suffering, and we don't see or understand what you're doing to meet that moment. And so, in my opinion, if we kind of boil this down to a very personal level, and think about what we need as individuals in a time of crisis, it's to know that there's somebody there looking out for us, who's there to help us and provide us what we need in that moment. And that just was not happening at the level that it needed to in the communities that were impacted by the flood.
Justin, in the aftermath of the response of so many community organizations, Justin worked with the Y, but there was a task force of 20 some odd community organizations involved. In the aftermath, as conversations have happened between different governments, and there were many involved, you know, have you felt like you've been able to get on people's level and they've been able to get on yours and saying, like, here's what happened, here's how we could have done better?
First, I want to be able to point out something that Sean said that I actually, Sean, I really appreciate. One thing to know is that everything you said is correct. Throughout this process, there were folks from all sides working, doing their absolute best to do what they could to help the situation. But the thing I felt was missed the most was an empathetic response. And countless times, many community members wanting to have a hero in this situation, wanting to have someone that's going to let them know that they will be taken care of. And I think it's also important to note that we're talking about a community that historically has never felt that from a public official standpoint. So there is this history that we have to consider. But I you know, after processing and thinking about everything, that's the thing that I felt that was missed the most, because there weren't resources there. The groups that you talked about, you know, one of them we have to call out is the Harvey Family Foundation. They were, specifically Armand Harvey, he was there every day, all day, 7 days a week, and even to this day, feeling the impact of his effort. And so for this man and the team that he assembled around to help out, the thing that became the hardest is we had to find a way to be that hope and to be that symbolic hero for folks without having access to the fullness of resources that they need. So I just, in retrospect, I would say that is something that without that, people end up coming up with their own theories on why the situation occurred, or what's going to become of their property. All of these theories start to go in the air. So that's important for me to point out. Please say your question again, Will.
In terms of the conversations you've had in the aftermath with different government and official people, do you feel like there's an understanding between the community and the government about what happened and what should happen going forward?
I would say the simple answer is no. The majority of residents I've spoken to throughout the various communities and neighborhoods that were impacted, and I still to this day having conversations, still do not feel seen, still do not feel valued, and still do not feel as if they're going to be taken care of. That's at the root of the heart and of the conversations that I have. Again, whether there's truth in that or not, I don't know if it matters, right? Because their truth is that is the circumstance and that's the case. So I would say quite frankly, no, they do not feel seen, valued, and they're going to be taken care of.
I want to come back to Sean in a minute because I'm sure he wants to talk about that. But Ramsey, let's go to you next, because I think, you know, you were in such a unique position in New Orleans where you were kind of the person between the politicians and the community groups and the people on the ground.
It's a lot of fun.
And I'm sure a lot of what you were focusing on is like logistics and getting the logistics right. But what about that empathy component? You know, was that a big thing you tried to bring into the work, or was it more like we have to fix the pipes under the ground and it's easy to get lost in that, making sure we got the bulldozers out there?
You cannot fix pipes if people don't believe that you're going to fix the pipes. And you cannot, as a government, get people to believe you if you don't listen to them and show that you understand precisely what their problems are. And this gets to, provide you two examples. In the wake of Hurricane Ida, our city lost, there's 9 inbound transmission lines. All of them broke, and the city of New Orleans had no power for about 2.5 weeks. We had a very small team. We're living in New Orleans City Hall. Our generator in City Hall broke down. We had to figure out how to get communication out to the public. One of the things that we ended up having to do, because of our sewer lift station shutting down, was we had to pump direct sewage from the city. We still had a population of 60 to 70% of the city, which is somewhere in the range of 200,000 people still in the city. We had to pump sewage directly into the Mississippi River. Guess where we get our potable water? The Mississippi River. Now, there's some art to where we get the water and where we were pumping sewage, but I could tell at the time nobody wanted to publicly say that. And one of the things you learn, particularly as I am a New Orleans has a racial history, a unique history of everybody coming there and take a look at me. I'm from San Diego and I'm a white guy and I ran infrastructure for the city of New Orleans. I am so cautious. That's the wrong word. I am so focused on telling people the message, even though it's not the message they want, because they will respect you more. And I went out on a television camera and I said, we're pumping our sewage directly into the Mississippi River. And some of the people who are pumping sewage go, why did you just do that? And I said, because you're not going to have to talk about it tomorrow. And it never came up again because we were transparent. The other lesson I would say, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, I was very fortunate. I had the role of overseeing the rebuilding of the school system. State took over the school system and we shut down 52 schools, rebuilt back 85 schools using a FEMA settlement and built back green schools. It was amazing. However, when we first started doing it, we had all these destroyed hulks of unmaintained school buildings. And on the west bank of the Mississippi River, it's a very small community, there was a school that was just partially destroyed, and we wanted to build a new school. And our state superintendent, who's from New Orleans, said to me, whatever you do, do not demolish the hulk until we start driving piles for the new school. And the message to me was, it might be crap in your mind as a public infrastructure guy, but it's their crap. And they will not trust you to build a new school if you tear away the thing, the hulk, until they see that you're investing in that community. That was the best lesson I ever got, is physically showing citizens what you are capable of doing. And when you can't do it, tell them immediately.
Stay with that, Sean. How do you, try to build back trust after what happened?
Well, one, I think we have to continue to do better at acknowledging what we didn't do. We have to hear folks when they say that they're frustrated. And look, sometimes the criticism or frustration, there wasn't anything that I could necessarily do about it. But I have the position that I have, and people want somebody to blame, because why wouldn't they? To contextualize what happened, folks were either at work or at home, did literally nothing wrong, and hours later, everything that they own was gone. Right here in San Diego. People don't think that happens here. Everything. So the big things like cars and furniture, and the little things like pictures and valuables that you simply cannot replace. Gone, just like that. So of course, people want someone to blame and be mad at. And that's part of the job. It's showing up there and receiving that, even though it's hard. And I tried my best, even when it was really hard, to never make a promise that I was not sure I could deliver on. And as much as I wanted to say, I will make sure there is a hotel room for you tomorrow, and even if I knew that it was in the works, I would not say it until I was certain about it, because the last thing that those folks deserved was to be let down again. So, but government's full of people, right? And people are complicated, and people are different, and people don't all act the same way. And that's good in many cases, but it also means that our response can feel disjointed. There was no meeting where we sat down and said, how are we going to handle the way that folks are feeling? And how are each of us in our individual capacities going to make sure that we're making folks, the community, feel seen and heard? And that probably should have been the first meeting. Before the meeting, with how the actual response should go and who was going to drive what where. That part about recognizing what people were going through and how we could make sure that they knew that. One other thing that I wanted to add, because Justin's work's been so incredible, and the folks who I spent the first 4 or 5 days really wanting to figure out how I could help. I just was and my team, as soon as the city council meeting ended that Monday night, one of my reps and I, we went out and we went from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood in our district and part of District 4, because they didn't have a council member at the time, to see what the impacts looked like. And there was, I couldn't fix it right then and there. I knew that. Make sure folks felt that you cared a little bit. And the next few days after that was trying to figure out how we fix it. And I think because that's my instinct, is we want to fix things for better and for worse. And then on, I think, the Saturday of that week, I walked into the Jackie Robinson Y, and the community was in their meeting because I was there to drop some stuff off. And folks in the room were getting stuff done. The community members were working together to get stuff done. And they were doing it from that perspective of how do we take care of people. And that was a distinct difference than the meeting I was in the day before with government officials who obviously cared about people, but were trying to figure out, what to do and who was responsible for what. And there were basics that, I think about Armand, I think about that meeting on the Friday before Saturday, and Armand was in that meeting. And I was like, can we get some instructions and directions for folks with guidelines as to what is and isn't safe to go in in terms of buildings? Do they need masks on? Because these folks love their community and they love their community members, and they're not thinking twice, and there could be some real impacts. And we weren't even prepared for that sort of people-centered response. So anyway, well, my long way of saying what I was asked to respond to it is, my short way of saying that is, you just have to accept that people are going to be mad at you, and they have every reason to be mad at someone or something. And our job in government is to be a representative, and sometimes we're a representative to the people, and sometimes we're a representative for the people to receive the things that they have to get off their chest. And that we just can't be sensitive about it.
So, Sean, given all we're talking about everything that transpired, how do you feel like you're moving forward? At one point we were talking about doing a stormwater tax. There were some technicalities in Sacramento where it's like, okay, this isn't going to pass, so we're not going to put this on the ballot. So, on the one hand, you were thinking about that project of like how we have $1.6 billion in stormwater needs in the city of San Diego or whatever. And then also we have this kind of empathy and trust thing, which I knew we were going to talk about, but didn't realize we were going to talk about so much, and clearly plays such a big role here. What are you trying to do moving forward to get this right?
Well, one, and the first mission, I think, for all of us, and I will say that I think government has to do more, should have done better, but as a community, y'all, like, we're leaving some folks behind, and it's not okay. We're leaving people who've been left behind by the city and by San Diego region behind for generations. You're leaving them behind. So we can't let that happen, right? So we have to work to make sure that everyone who's impacted, and nobody's going to be made whole. I think as much as we would like to do that, I think most folks are pretty cognizant that there's things that we just can't replace. There's, whether it's belongings or time or trauma, it can't all be fixed, but we can make sure that nobody gets left behind. And so that effort continues, a person at a time, through the work of the San Diego Housing Commission in partnership with community to try to find permanent housing for folks who've been displaced or get people back into their homes, if that's possible. That is imperfect. We have a finite amount of resources. It might sound like a lot of money, $7 million, but it doesn't go that far, especially in a housing environment like the one we're in here in San Diego right now. So we have to prioritize. We prioritize the people who were living in hotels and didn't have an identifiable place to go besides those hotels. And bit by bit, we're working to get folks back into permanent housing. And we're going to need the community's help on this. There was an incredible response from within the Southeastern community in particular. And there was some philanthropy that showed up and was very helpful and has been. But I also know that San Diego can and should do more, just quite frankly. And this is an area with too much abundance and too many resources to allow folks to, seniors in particular, to continue to sit in moldy, rotting homes for lack of resources, and for people with families to not know where their long-term home is going to be for lack of resources. None of us should be okay with that. And so I think, what am I doing? It's not being okay with that. at refusing to be okay with an idea that we will ever move on from this until everyone's taken care of.
Right, right. I want to go back to something you said earlier that Sean just touched on, Ramsey. You talked about if the response isn't to the most vulnerable people in the situation, we're not going to get it right. And Sean's saying those people are still being left behind to some extent. How do you structure the resources and the response towards the most vulnerable when that's not really the way we're used to directing resources in this society?
So I think it's a phenomenal question, and I'm going to give one example and then one sort of thematic statement, if I can. The first example was when COVID broke out, March 2020. For about a 3-week stretch, New Orleans had the highest rate of infection on the planet. It was a terrifying time. And one of the things that we recognized as sort of FEMA geeks, because I was a FEMA pup post Hurricane Katrina, and we all sort of became experts at how to use federal money. Our former mayor ran the IIJ and the IRA for President Biden, Mitch Landrieu. Is we said, who is going to eat? How are kids who are on free and reduced? Sorry, that was a rough time. How are kids who are on free and reduced lunch in the city of New Orleans going to get lunch? And how are people who don't leave their home and rely on Meals on Wheels, et cetera, going to get food? And so we put, I remember doing this in my office with a whiteboard, and we said, COVID created it's a disaster. It is a FEMA reimbursable disaster. We have a need. And we made an audacious request to FEMA of giving 3 meals a day to New Orleanians who met certain criteria, and we were very broad with the criteria. And we mandated that those meals were cooked in local restaurants. We kept 300 businesses alive, and we fed 75,000 meals a day. And we did that for 2 years. And thank you. The team who did that are people who are civil servants working to this day in New Orleans City Hall. When you think about government employees, these are not people who are there to consume a pension. When you give a government employee who likes what they do a charge and they come up with a solution like that, we did it for 2 years, 3 million meals, like some absurd number of meals. It was insane. And that to me is when government really works, and you don't hear about it. You only hear when government screws up. I mean, that's just part of the job. And Sean, I'm sure you know this. Like, that's all you get. The thematic thing, I would say, and that is identify where people have needs in an event like that. But the thematic thing I would say is I have a client, I spent a lot of time in Hawaii, and after the wildfire, their ask of my firm was, go get us an appropriation to rebuild West Maui. And my response was, have you seen how Congress works? Like, that doesn't work, right? The DRF, which is the funding mechanism for FEMA, was not filled until about 3 or 4 days ago. It's called the Disaster Relief Fund. That's like the petty cash for FEMA to pay for stuff. But our response was, are you looking at the Inflation Act? Are you looking at the IRA? And we put together audacious requests for mitigation infrastructure to make it so when somebody, microgrids, you lose power, you now have a YMCA that is empowered through a natural gas generator, a battery wall, solar, whatever, and people can go into air conditioning for 5 to 10 days or something like that. To me, government needs to be a fundraising machine given the amount of money out there to address these things.
So I want to come back to that question of money, but Justin, when I visit, I mean, I think anyone who visited the Y, like Sean was just talking about, is like really just a powerful thing to behold. And I felt that the minute I was there, and I remember Justin saying something to me about how the approach was just to understand each person and hear each person, and that was step one, and that is what it didn't necessarily seem like it was coming from government. But I guess, Justin, what is it that you hope government could do better to meet the moment? You know, is it about that empathy stuff? Is it something different?
Bro, so this is wild because I'm having to process and revisit some of these like memories, and I'm having a strong reaction myself, you know. And you know, you used a term, FEMA reimbursable. That is so triggering for me because I don't know how many families I spoke to that were hoping that their damage would be reimbursable, and FEMA's not going to reimburse it. FEMA's not going to reimburse it. So that's a powerful thing to hear, and that is a little nuance from this whole situation. The amount of lack of clarity that went through from who was responsible, who would help, the way answers were given, completely without empathy from all phases. If someone had an ability to provide a resource and the answer was you couldn't have that resource, it was given in a cold way. So yeah, I would say, again, for me, when I made that statement, it's because my career has predicated on listening to people. And I know that if you listen, and you listen with curiosity, the person in front of you is going to, again, feel valued and seen. They're going to feel that. For folks that are shocked, have lost everything, and have no clear pathway to what the next week's going to look like, uncertainty it's traumatic. So yeah, I mean that's what was brought up, man. But FEMA, with it not being reversible, man. I mean there's so many folks that were just crushed by what was and what wasn't. So if there is a way to put a focus on providing clarity and answers and an ability to respond in a way that feels genuine and authentic and loving, man, that wasn't there, and that I believe hurt more folks than most of the things that went down.
I have some other questions, but either of y'all want to respond to that? Oh, good. You brought federal, you know, we're talking about federal money now a bit, and it seems like, Ramsey, that was something that you really like opened up the tap on a little bit. Like there had been Katrina money, billions that have been sitting around for a long time, I think, and you managed to start spending it and like brought spending up 10, 20 fold. So what's your advice to Sean and to San Diego about how to get this money so this doesn't happen again?
No, that's a great question. You know, the way that I think it's important that residents look at disasters are the first responders are generally the people in your community. If the federal government is being turned to as the first responder, you're sort of too late. In New Orleans, that lesson was very clear after Hurricane Katrina. The federal response to Hurricane Katrina was a scarring legacy for people who do this work, with the exception of one agency. I'm curious, does anybody know which agency it was? The United States Coast Guard, which...
That's going to be my guess.
Thank you, Will. My kid's going to she said she's going to go to the Coast Guard Academy and fly choppers, and I'm really proud of her. But the United States Coast Guard rescued something more than 50,000 people from rooftops. Everybody else just collapsed. And it's also, like, to your point, Will, about money, we have to be really cautious about thinking that federal money is going to solve any problem. Hurricane Katrina was the tip of the spear of climate change emergencies in the United States. Congress appropriated over $120 billion to rebuild the federal levee system, among other things. I don't know that would happen now. I was on a call right before I walked in here of somebody saying this is like Hurricane Katrina, but a swath across 7 states in the southeast of the United States. That's how bad it is right now. And again, it's now, and people are responding a certain way. But I don't know that the federal government will appropriate that much money toward one thing. Now, I think it's vulnerable to think that. I think communities need to look at what they prioritize and listen to their residents. And I think now it's really hard. I think as much as social media is an incredible instrument for notifying people. We have a great system called NOLA Ready, where you'll get a text, you are notified when things are happening. It's also mind-numbing at times, and you get 20 of them in a day and you're on vacation. But you have to look at what your community needs and make a decision on that. And Hurricane Katrina, just last sort of an example on this, and I think, Justin, this is knowing that you're talking to people on a regular basis. I think this is a big lesson for me early in my career. We had a school system. It had 130 schools, but it had enough seats for 107,000 kids. But due to a variety of factors, there were only 63,000 kids in those schools when Katrina hit. So we said, we got to right-size this. And so what did we do? We ended up having to shut down 52 schools. We did that, I remember, in 1 year we did 237 community meetings. And this was in 2009, 10, right? Because Obama came and announced it on the 5th anniversary of Katrina, which was 2010. And we got people to agree to shut their schools down. And I remember at the time saying, if I still live where I grew up, I went to Grant Elementary School, I went to Point Loma High School, back when those were actual middle-class communities, what would it be like if somebody told me Grant will not be back, Point Loma will not be back, you're going to have to go to Scripps Ranch? I'd be like, I'm not going to Scripps Ranch, you got to be freaking kidding me, I'm a Point Loma Pointer. Mm-hmm. And what I remember we did is we would have these meetings and we would have our design chief stand up there, and you would have the layout from a spatial view of where the school would be. And I remember there's elderly folks sitting there. They're usually the people who come to the community meetings, and one of them goes, well, you've got trash pickup in front of my house. And the guy goes, you've got bus drop-off in front of my house. And the woman literally says to the guy, would you trade? Will you take bus drop-off in exchange for trash pickup? And they go, yeah. And our design guy takes the schematic and goes like this, and we built the school. Literally, I remember 18 public meetings in 1 week. I looked really bad. But you have to listen to people. Like as Obama said, I love this quote, we're Americans, we do big things. It's harder to do big things at this moment when people are always saying something one way or the other, but that's why it's harder to do big things. You have to build a coalition and then take the heat when the heat starts happening.
How do we do the big things, Sean? Easy one for you. I mean, Ramsey said the federal money's probably not coming.
Except the IIJ and the IRA money. FEMA money you don't want to rely on.
Well, I think there's whether it's preparing for climate emergencies or other big, bold goals, it's always the same formula, right? It's getting folks on the same page who have a shared vision, a common goal. And if we don't do that work to create the shared vision and the common goal, then we're not going to get it. And I think so often the conversations around the climate crisis or climate change or mitigation is framed in the context of what we're going to lose and what we'll have to do without. And if we're doing this well, we're talking about it in the incredible opportunity that it poses to turn communities who were not done right when they were initially built, do right by them in terms of environmental justice, to make those greener, healthier, more vibrant communities where life expectancy isn't decades shorter than in wealthier parts of the city. There's opportunity in the incredible jobs that can provide for folks who work in the city or work in the private sector. There's opportunity in taking in bringing nature back into the fold in San Diego in a way that existed, a century ago, or maybe even less than that, but was paved over at some point in time. But if it's all framed within the context of, all right, here's what we're going to have to stop doing, and we have to change this behavior, and we're going to present you a plan that we've developed on our own, and to do that, no one's going to want to do that. No one wants to hear government's plan for you having less of the things that you like.
Austerity, basically.
That's what it ends up being received as, right? But if it, again, comes from a place of what is our goal? It's to create healthy, safe communities that are accessible to people up and down the income ladder, that are healthy and safe regardless of your age, regardless of your race, regardless of your income level. And we get a sense of what that means to the different communities in San Diego. And we start to work toward that. The sacrifices that have to be made in order to pursue that goal will be much easier to swallow. My background is in organizing and coaching, and I've watched people make incredible sacrifices when they know what they're working toward. But when you are asking people to sacrifice and they don't know what they're aiming toward, then it just feels like doing something that sucks.
Do you think that San Diego's getting across that vision right now of like a greener, healthier city?
No, and I don't think we're doing that to the extent that we can. And that was so. There was there's the emergency we were responding to, and the emergency we were trying to prevent the call for more investment in our stormwater infrastructure. Which, by the way, if the sales tax passes, we will have significantly more resources to address our stormwater deficit.
Are you committing to using them for the stormwater deficit?
To the extent that I have power as a single council member, absolutely. And I had conversations with the mayor where I know we're on the same page about that. That was a very important conversation before we pulled back on the infrastructure, on the stormwater measure. So we had an opportunity there to not just resource ourselves, but to create kind of a platform for which community to really do that dreaming and thinking about what we want communities to look like and feel like, and then have the resources to pursue it. We need to kind of go back to the drawing board in terms of finding the resources, but in the interim, we definitely should be doing more of that work to make sure, again, that folks see the opportunity here and have an opportunity to paint the vision that they have for their communities.
You brought up earlier, Sean. I'll ask Justin about it first. Talk to us a little bit about where people are at now, flood survivors. You know, what do you hear from people you talk to in terms of their how they're doing financially, emotionally?
The emotional part, it's easy to understand. There's still pain. There's still trauma. There's trauma that's not being healed. That exists, and that's on top of trauma that already exists prior. So, every neighborhood you have to be very, very cognizant of that. There's its own shared history of pain, of neglect. If we don't consider that, anything you try to put on top of it's not going to be meaningful. If you had money or access to families that had money, you're doing much better. If you lived in an apartment and the apartment was low income and the landlord wanted to flip that apartment to get higher prices, you're looking for new homes. And if you're looking for new homes and you're wanting to stay in San Diego based on what you were paying for rent, you're out of luck. That's the truth. You are out of luck. Now you're being forced to relocate out of a community that you've lived in ever since ever, that your grandparents lived in ever since ever, and now you're going to across town, and you've lost your connection to one of the things that meant the most to you, your neighborhood. So it's that's the most painful part. Hey, the thing I want to be able to say as well, though, and this has to be in place. What you said about FEMA, and I appreciate, man. It's not a knock on you. You're a San Diego guy. I got love for you. But FEMA, on the ground level, was seen as though that was going to be the resource that was going to come in and save the day, right? And I like what I kind of like that slogan, FEMA, don't count on us, right? I mean, and not in a bad way, but it goes to the fact that people just didn't know where to get answers from. And that again, the uncertainty of not knowing is what made every day harder and harder and harder. So, but yeah, people are still in pain. People are still suffering. The question Sean, if you could have for me though, is why did we not have the military involvement in this? It was on a small scale, volunteers here and there, but on a grand scale, I didn't see him present. And I was hoping that you could provide insight into that.
Yeah, I will be honest, in the conversations that I was in, military assistance wasn't something that came up. And I think we learned a lot in San Diego about the the sequencing of requests and how important that is, and how if you mess up one step and somebody jumps ahead of somebody else, then it will screw everything up because you might be told no, and you're being told no because you asked and not the right person a layer up. But they don't tell you that's why you're being told no, and so then you just think that resource is off the table. I think there were a lot of lessons learned on that front, but it just wasn't a thing that came up in the rooms about it.
So you bring up a good thing though, Justin, because I heard that too, from different residents. They're like, we are like this military town. Why can't the military help us? And it's not a tool that I think the city sees as in its toolbox. And I wonder if you can speak to that at all, Ramsey. I feel like a lot of times citizens will have common sense thoughts that governments just don't consider. And I'm not even trying to knock on it. We all get stuck in our processes.
I haven't worked in government for 2.5 years, and I feel like I'm sitting here like as the government guy. But I'm
able to shift that.
No, thanks, Sean. You are a phenomenal politician to pull that off. So I do make a living interpreting the government at this moment. So Justin, your frustration with FEMA is the most legitimate thing in a normal disaster. I uniquely live in a city where we have mastered that relationship. And it's purely because it went so poorly 20 years ago. And it's important to acknowledge, I have to say this, FEMA is not what it was 20 years ago. It is not what it was. There was a gentleman by the name of Craig Fugate, looking him up. He was an orphan, did not go to college. He was the emergency manager for the state of Florida. He's a volunteer firefighter. He was named in the world of emergency management. Craig Fugate is the holy grail. He was named by Obama FEMA director. He was there for 8 years. He focused on mitigation, individual assistance, which is the program that funds individuals. Public assistance is kind of more what I do, which is how do you fund governments and mitigation and that kind of thing. Government infrastructure, et cetera. The one thing Craig Fugate and the best people at FEMA will tell you, do not rely on us to respond. Our job is we are a checkbook. What has to respond in a disaster are local governments, local organizations, and to a much lesser degree, the state. In a small, and I don't mean this small, but in a smaller scale disaster, the way it works, and I've been in the process of writing these, mayor says, my resources are overwhelmed, does a request to the state. State gets it, looks at it, says we are overwhelmed, does a request to the federal government. If you are lucky, you get a pre-disaster declaration by a president. I've been a part of those where the money starts moving even before the disaster occurs. In the smaller scale events, that's where FEMA is not equipped to be there as a rescue entity at all. And there are very specific rules on using military assets. Posse comitatus is, God, I teach this stuff at Tulane, and I haven't used these words. When you use posse comitatus, that's bad. But the California National Guard, which is led by a guy I know very formally until a year or two ago, General Dave Baldwin. The California National Guard is a phenomenal organization and can be mobilized to do these things. But what you have to have is an internal culture within a government that understands how this works, so they're not figuring out after a disaster occurs. In emergency management, one of the one things we always tell each other is, I do not want to wait for a disaster to exchange business cards. I want to know who to call when something bad happens. After Hurricane Ida, we had a labor strike, and that labor strike is probably the wrong term. We had a failure of a private contractor with trash, and we had 2 months of trash piled up in people's homes, creating a horrible sanitation situation. I knew the guy to call at the White House. We got a FEMA declaration within 24 hours, and within 3 days, we got all the trash off the streets, or at least that process started. This is a real sector. This is something that people need to study who are in government, and you have to know this stuff so you can be ready to serve your residents when an event comes.
Can the city do better on that, Sean? Having somebody to play exactly that role?
Yeah, I think there's folks who have emergency responsibilities and leadership responsibilities, but proof's in the pudding, right? Absolutely, we could have done better. Yeah, keep that one short.
Okay, it's time for questions. Our first question will be asked by Sanjana Fitzgerald and Aaron Pricefellow. Where are you in the room? Oh, there you are. Hi. Each year, the Aaron Price Fellows Program selects 40 kind, inquisitive, open-minded ninth graders from a pool of 300 applicants for a 3-year journey. They go behind the scenes to see how cities function, explore the role of community members in shaping society, and develop empathy and skills for navigating a diverse world. The program is a high school leadership experience that started in 1991 by the Price family. The mission of the Price Fellows Program is to prepare a highly motivated and diverse group of San Diego public high school students to be responsible, engaged, and caring members of the community. Today, there are over 1,000 Price Fellows with 500 carrying out local missions. You want to come up and ask your question?
It could be like the NPR ad.
Wow. Just the ad lady? Come on.
Thank you so much. So my name is Sanjana Gangli Fitzgerald, and so I wanted to ask about the same topic that we've been talking about here, about addressing impacts of a history of government neglect towards our Black and Brown communities in San Diego, and the racist land use decisions that created redlining throughout our region and eventually did play into the intricacies of what happened with the January floods this year. I wanted to ask what systemic changes need to be made in order to make the appropriate response for historically redlined communities facing crises in the future and repair this kind of historical trauma and neglect that is glaringly obvious today.
I think I'm not going to let you out of that one, Sean. You might have to take it first.
Thank you, Sanjaya. Sanjaya, you were also at Chavista, correct? Yes. Yeah. Well, it's a lot. There's a lot there. But it's a super important question, right? And I think it's the sort of question that we should be thinking about every time we make decisions about our budget and infrastructure and investment in our communities. One, acknowledging that happened, right? So if we look at who lives along Schroeder's Creek and the history of those communities, where investment was made in the past and what investments weren't made, the disparities and opportunity in San Diego from neighborhood to neighborhood, zip code, I think they're unacceptable, and I think a majority of San Diegans actually would when they find out about this. I think even folks who live in communities that are doing better, most people who live in those communities would be uncomfortable with the idea that children who are born in zip codes here in San Diego have significantly less life expectancy than in other parts of the city. Nobody should be okay with that. So if we acknowledge that, right, we accept that as fact, but don't accept that as a way that the world should be or has to be, then we start to make different policy decisions. So there are certain things that the city has changed over the past few years that I think will help on this front. We unlocked the way that infrastructure is invested in. Previously, development impact fees poured into these lockboxes, and there were over 40 of them across the city. And newer, wealthier communities had so much of those lockboxes, sometimes they couldn't even spend them down. Whereas other communities that had fewer resources and less investment had nothing in them. And we've unlocked that now so that it goes into a citywide fund that can now be distributed in a much more equitable way. We created a climate equity fund, which is much smaller than I would like it to be, but is specifically meant to put investments into communities that have been harmed by systemic racism. We've done similar policies with respect to parks, and we know that parks and infrastructure can kind of go hand in hand and certainly be an important part of mitigating climate change and be an incredibly important resource during times of emergency, whether that means a heat wave or the aftermath of a flood. So we've started to make these changes, and now it's going to be, I think the even more important part is directing resources to turn what is, I think, pretty sound policy now into action on the ground. And that's might even be the tougher conversation at this point, right? Because that means, no, the pie's not going to be split in 9 equal directions across 9 council districts. And that's when it gets hard, right?
Do you want to weigh in on that?
I was just going to add one quick point, and Sanjay, great question. I applied to be an Aaron Price Fellow. I was not accepted as a kid. But I was lab partners with one of his younger sisters, and we dissected something together that I don't remember when we were in high school, physiology, I think. So you raise an excellent point, and I want to fine-tune it a little bit, that one of the biggest vulnerabilities that climate change will put on low to moderate income communities What is the biggest asset low to moderate income families have? What's their biggest asset, if they're lucky? Their home. Property insurance rates in the next, depending on Southeast United States right now, what insurers are going to be doing to Georgia, Western North Carolina. They're right, again, 4 million people do not have power right now, and most of them live nowhere near the coast.
I think, Ryan, just to jump in with what you're saying, I was recently listening to a report on this and shocked, but a lot of people just can't even get home insurance now. People are dumping them on their home insurance. And so if the only asset you have is your home and you can't insure it, where are we at then?
And just one point to that, Will. What can government do? Incentivize mitigation. Fortified roofs, home elevations. There are things you can do where your insurance premium will be lowered because you just made a mitigation effort on your single family or multifamily.
So I'm going to go through some questions here we have on the note cards. Does the city have a system in place to keep track of flood victims who are in hotels, now don't have a home, and could be homeless?
So everyone who was in the hotel voucher program is now in a different, has had options to enter in different programs with different sort of resources. They would have had to opt into that, but there were some folks who didn't. So in that way, yes, that if you were in that program, the Housing Commission has made multiple attempts to try to contact those folks. But and Justin, I think, was getting to this earlier. I know that there's folks on a weekly basis that are just now being discovered, if you will, as being impacted, and they were just riding it out, or they didn't realize it was as bad as it was, and there were different waves of folks realizing that what was happening in their homes was not sustainable, and so I think it's less about at this point. It's less about keeping track of the folks who are in the hotel program, and I think a little bit more about making sure again that we do everything we can to make sure that no one's left behind, and that those folks who are still seeking assistance, we are doing everything we can to connect them with resources.
You want to speak on that, Justin? Or question about displacement, because you brought it up earlier, that people who were living in apartments, if they were flooded out, the apartment was ruined. Landlords see that as an opportunity to make the apartment nicer, raise the rent a great deal, something they wouldn't be able to do with the person in the apartment because of rent cap laws. Ramsey, can you talk about it a little? What was the effect on New Orleans of displacement post-Katrina, and what should we be keeping in mind about that?
Yeah, that is a phenomenal question. New Orleans in many ways is a very different city than it was pre-Katrina. And certain folks, generally you can kind of demographically attribute the sentiment one way or the other, think it's better. Other people yearn for the past. Houses are more expensive. Insurance is far more expensive. A huge amount of federal money was invested in the city at the same time that the global financial crisis unveiled. And I remember at the time sort of thinking that we had this happy financial bubble over us because everything was getting rebuilt. What I think is important to remember about disasters is they accentuate where everybody already is on the socioeconomic ladder. When we had a hurricane in our city 2-3 weeks ago, there are certain folks in my kind of world who I check in on. And I make sure they're okay. I check to see if they need something. I don't really get people checking on me because they know I'll be okay. We can leave. There's a lot of people who can't leave. What a disaster does is it really shows you who you are as a place. And it shows you what you need to do and probably what you should have done a long time ago. So if I think about San Diego, there's this thing in the resilience world, shocks versus stresses. The shock is what we all think about. The stress is the quiet thing that eventually just one day you turn around and your neighborhood's homes are $1 million. Well, what does that do to a community? And I'm not going to get into policy prescriptions on it because I think everybody knows what those are, but they just keep talking about them and time goes on and that stress gets harder and harder and harder. Don't wait for the shock to address these issues. Take them on when they're stressing because people quietly are suffering. And I think the panel right before us, the gentleman who said 1 to 2 people a day fall into homelessness in the city. And he said that to somebody and a guy turned around and said, well, that was me today. I mean, we have to do better as a society to prepare to make it so that doesn't happen.
Can you say more about that displacement, Justin? What do you feel like is the impact to the city from the displacement that's happening?
I think we're going to lose or have severely weakened some of the cultural richness that's found in Southeast San Diego. I'm talking generations, we're talking families that have been here before most of us are here. To lose that it's heartbreaking. So I mean that's kind of what I see is just losing the richness of the heritage that's been there, the culture that's been there, the stories, all these families that are just so connected to that area. A lot of them are gone now, and I think they're going to continue to be leaving because of lack of opportunity.
Yeah, please.
The first place Roberto and I stopped after City Council on Monday, the Monday of the flood, was an backyard apartment in Stockton. And been just every bottom apartment there had been totally wiped out. And folks looked shell-shocked, and the lights were out, and it was very intense. They should not have been in there that night. But we told them, hey, there's shelter, please go. And they were afraid to leave. They were afraid to leave because they weren't sure if they were going to be able to come back. And Roberto went back time and time and time again, encouraging those folks to go. When we got the hotel programs stood up and said, you don't have to go to a gym. Because one thing government wasn't real good at recognizing was that not every neighborhood was going to be comfortable going into another neighborhood for really good reasons to find emergency shelter. And if they, quite frankly, if they planned with community, those are the exact sort of things that, and like I'm Menon, somebody from the neighborhood will tell you, I'm not going there to feel safe. Like that's just not happening. I can't go there and feel safe. And we got them out. They eventually went, and then they went back in because they were afraid that they were going to be forced out. And their landlord was nothing better. He's no better than a slumlord. He's a slumlord, effectively. Those were not nice apartments. They weren't well maintained, but they knew that if they gave those apartments up, there was no way that they would afford to be able to continue to live in the city. So I have a lot of conversations, and I might offend a person or two in this room by saying this, but I'll say it anyway. There's a lot of conversations about community character, preserving community character. And almost always those conversations are centered around what a community looks like, the buildings that are there. And we need to be far more committed to maintaining community character when it means keeping people and families and communities in the places that they are. So we have fights about whether there should be more affordable housing or more housing, period, and throughout the city. It is because we are trying to maintain community character in places where folks will be driven out by economic forces the moment there is an opportunity to do so, whether that is a disaster or something else. And so I could probably do a better job of articulating that on a day-to-day basis, but that is a big part of it. It's ensuring that it's not a middle income or upper middle class, upper middle income earner who's competing with the folks who were flooded out in Stockton or Southcrest or Shelltown, southeastern San Diego, for that new place. And right now, with the lack of housing that we have, those competitions happen, and you can guess who loses in those fights. So I just wanted to make sure that part was said as well. If I can add one positive note. So one of the communities that was impacted in my district was Village Greens Apartments. There was, I think, 57 bottom units all flooded out. And everyone had to be out. Everybody had to be out, and people lost everything. And it was really hard. It was we saw, I think, a really good community response there. It doesn't mean it was perfect, because it was far from perfect. And there are people who are still angry with them.
Is that the one where you had asked the city beforehand to potentially clean out the stormwater drain, but it hadn't happened?
Correct. So we will never know if it would have flooded in a way that I think the engineers say that it would have. In either case, that doesn't matter to the people who were impacted, right? But we held regular meetings with the community. We tried to keep updates. The affordable housing developer who owns that property was very committed to get everyone back in. That doesn't mean that they were perfect or the property management company was perfect, because nobody is perfect. But we worked really hard together. And a few weeks ago, we had a celebration to welcome folks back to their community. And there's some folks who've moved on to different places, but there are a lot of people who are still there. And they maintained a sense of community. They've been through hell and back together.
Is this one run by SDHC? Sorry.
No, that one is it's Wakefield.
Okay.
And Rebecca Louie, their CEO, could not have been more committed to getting folks back into their homes. But that was a deed-restricted, affordable housing community, which is very different than our privately owned and for-profit endeavors. So that can happen, and we saw it on a relatively small scale, and it was hard, it was challenging. But I do think that it creates an opportunity for me, in my capacity, to challenge all of us, me and you, to have more of those stories happen. Because while there's already been a lot of displacement, the whole story has not been written yet. And I guarantee you, I promise you, that if everyone in San Diego, at this exact moment, said, we will not allow anybody else to be unnecessarily displaced from our communities, it would not happen. The resources exist in this city. We wouldn't have to go anywhere else. We don't need FEMA, we don't need the military. They exist in this community. Look at the stuff that we build and the things that we build them for, and tell us that we don't have the money to get those folks back in there.
So you need what you're saying is you need these people to put more pressure on y'all in the council to make that happen?
Not just government. I am the far left flank of our city council, and I believe government should and has to do gigantic things. I'm a proponent of public housing. This should not just be on government. This is on all of us. It's on philanthropy. It's on individual community members to dig in and make sure that we don't leave folks behind. Do we believe that San Diego should be a place where people lose everything and are displaced from this city because of a natural disaster?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for taking us in a positive direction. We definitely all appreciate that. That was great. Love y'all so much. MacKenzie, Elmer again.
Thanks, Will. Okay, thanks for joining us. The next session is our final keynote speaker. That's at 4:30 in the main theater. You can check out our website, voicesandiego.org. If you enjoyed our session, we have newsletters where we talk about environment, South County, North County, all kinds of fun stuff. Will sometimes writes about stadium debacles. So yeah, thanks to our sponsors, and everybody enjoy the end of the show.
Anytime, man.
Yeah, 18. What I'm